So I'm going to look really at some of the work we've been doing across, largely focusing on East Africa, and then towards the end of the talk a little bit about some of the work going across the university, across the African continent. So if we just initially look at a topographic map of African mountains on the left, a map of where people live within the African continent, we can see mountains are incredibly important. You know, apart from the Nile Delta and the Nile Valley, pretty much most of the people within the African continent live within Africa on the mountains. Particularly notable, obviously, the Ethiopian highlands, the west and east rift valleys of eastern Africa, the sort of Drakensberg of southern Africa, sort of Mount Cameroon over here, and of course the Atlas Mountains up in Morocco. So they're very important in terms of societies and where people live. They're also very important in terms of conservation. This is a picture of Ngorongoro Highlands, arguably one of the most important national parks within Eastern Africa, a World Heritage Site, an absolutely gem of biodiversity conservation. Outside of those protected areas, animals are allowed to roam fairly freely, but obviously with increasing pressures of climate change, population growth, land use conversion. These are some of the things we'll touch on later on. While those animals roam freely, they also are able to roam into agricultural areas, and obviously that then causes conflicts. The African mountains are home to, I say, large numbers of people, but obviously those people intensively use that landscape to the point where sometimes there's up to sort of 500-600 people per square kilometre. And some of the work we've been doing over the last 10 years, particularly, have been looking at the evolution of those terrace systems, how they initiated, how they've been subsequently managed, how they've then fallen into, sometimes into disuse, and also how various agencies are using them as a way to touch on issues such as sustainability and sustainable agriculture. Obviously, those types of population densities mean ultimately there's enormous land cover conversion. So this is a view across the Chima Highlands of Ethiopia, and we can see, you know, extensive terracing of those hillsides, little bits of forest remaining in the valleys, but effectively a transformed landscape. As well as being very important in terms of agriculture, they're also incredibly important in terms of pastoral societies, cattle keeping, and increasingly, particularly the last 100 or so years, cash crops such as coffee, tea, and again, just a view from Kilimanjaro. Oh, I don't know how that happened. Oh, my goodness, a new view, new use of the pointer. So the last sort of contextual slide is just a view towards Kilimanjaro, just emphasizing some of these rapid transformations that have occurred and some of those challenges that these transformations have resulted in. So I guess Kilimanjaro is quite iconic in that it's home to the sort of diminishing glacier up around about sort of 5,000 meters. It's also an area undergoing massive transformations in terms of agricultural expansion. So this is an area in between two very important national parks, Amboseli National Park and Tsavo National Park. And effectively, this is a migratory corridor for all those large ungulates, such as elephants, zebras, buffalo, etc. And of course, that's bringing increasing conflicts between people, the wildlife, and it's those conflicts that we're particularly interested in exploring through a tool that we developed about 6 or 7 years ago and have subsequently been applying in a number of different projects. So the tool that we developed is called Kesho. It's Swahili, it means tomorrow. And effectively what we do, we start off with running a whole series of participatory workshops. So that's bringing people in from different sectors of the communities. In the context of the initial development, it was focused around a project looking at carbon and carbon change and how carbon could evolve in Tanzania as part of a project with the World Wildlife Fund through an initiative called Reduced Emissions from Deforestation and Degradation. So it's one of the tools that has often been negotiated at those sort of global summits on climate change treaties in terms of trying to maximize carbon storage within our ecosystems. So we start off by bringing people together, normally about 30 or so people from different sectors, invariably because we're in this particular case study, we're interested in forestry, we're interested in land use change. Those sectors are conservation, agricultural, forest departments, government, NGO, and community organizations. Invariably, those 30 people have very different perspectives of land use change, how their land is going to evolve into the future. So we're focusing on future periods. And we invariably focus on two periods, 2030 and 2063. And this connects with the 2030 with the Sustainable Development Goals, 2063 with an African Union development agenda. And I'm just going to focus on the 2030, the sort of near vision of land use change. When we're setting up our workshops, of course, in different areas, different people have different perspectives and different things are driving those land use changes. So we have to incorporate that diversity by running a series of workshops. And in Tanzania, at a national scale, we ran 7 workshops in the 7 different regions. And in each of those regions, we had, try and come back. Yeah. In each of those regions, I say we had about 30 people, so about 190 or so people talking about land use change towards 2030 in Tanzania. We take all of those very diverse perspectives and then translate those in terms of land cover change. So we take all of those, that narrative, all the rich social information coming from those individual participants with different voices, and effectively boil all that down and convert a 1 kilometre grid cell from one land use type to another. In the initial application, we were very much focused around carbon, around forests, around change. And we have 2 different scenarios, a business as usual scenario and a green economy. So the green economy is where there is appreciation of ecosystem services, there's alternative energy supplies, there are transitions to sustainable use of forestry, effective governance, effective protected areas, versus the reverse under a business as usual. We just play out land cover change in Tanzania towards 2030, these 2 maps here. We can see under the business as usual, there's much more color in the landscape. That color effectively is capturing land use change, conversion of forest to agriculture largely. The difference between this and that in terms of carbon storage is it's about 150 gigatons of carbon difference, which equates to around about $8 billion difference. And to a country like Tanzania, that's a significant amount of potential funding. Of course, there are many debates about commodifying forests and how we should actually treat forests and try to manage them. But for many, many years, people have been trying to conserve forests, trying to prevent that sort of conversion into agriculture, trying to promote and maintain the diversity. When we start to put a price tag on that forest, of course, then the politicians, the people who are involved in actually managing that forest, start to listen a bit more. They listen even more when we start to think about how that transition of carbon change also equates to impacts on water, impacts on food, impacts on diversity. So what we were able to do, again, across the Tanzanian landscape, was able to look at that interaction between carbon change, between changing water, and changing diversity, and to see where there's going to be particularly high impacts in, say, on carbon and biodiversity, other places where there's going to be high impacts on water and biodiversity, where there's going to be high impacts on all of those dimensions. And those impacts are particularly felt across the mountains, across the Eastern Arc Mountains of Tanzania. Probably one of the most important biological hotspots across the world. This information is now part of the National Carbon Monitoring Centre within Tanzania, which was set up initially through some funding through the Norwegian government as part of their commitments into the global climate change negotiations, but is also managed by the Vice President's Office and linked into the Department of Forestry and Beekeeping. So again, it's a tool which has been developed and is now within the Tanzanian system, and can be used by Tanzania to then calculate how much carbon and how that impacts on some of those other vital ecosystem services like water and biodiversity. The nice thing about the tool is that we can use it in a whole range of different applications. So we've just seen an application in Tanzania at a national scale. Here we're going to focus on a very local scale, so a 40-kilometer transect across the Jima highlands of Ethiopia. Again, in this case, we ran 3 workshops across that 40-kilometer transect. It's a transect which is, again, very densely settled piece of mountain environment, large agroforestry, very important coffee production location. But it's also home to significant, highly biodiverse patches of forest. Coffee is a very important commodity, often grown in very traditional ways, so under existing forest. So this forest is selectively cleared, and coffee is planted as a shade crop, and it needs that shade of the overlying trees to maintain a healthy coffee production. This is also a project where we had other colleagues looking at coffee disease, particularly the spread of coffee leaf rust and berry borers on the actual coffee cherries themselves. Again, this is the sort of future vision of that Jima Highlands landscape, focusing on 2030. 4 different visions of the future. In this case, looking at our present-day landscape, looking at increasing agricultural expansion, so movement away from coffee. And these are all issues which have been highlighted by those participatory groups, the stakeholders which were brought into those workshops. One of the big challenges there is these diseases which are impacting on the coffee production at the moment. And that has led to people moving away from the traditional coffee production, and therefore the value of that semi-natural coffee forest has been lost. And along with that loss is then increased agricultural conversion, loss of diversity. So one vision is an expansion of increasingly degraded land, increasing cropland. Another vision is of increasing intensive coffee production, so moving away from traditional shade-managed coffee into a different type of coffee crop, which doesn't require the above-ground trees to shade the berries, versus a vision where the price for coffee increases. There is greater value into that traditional coffee production system. Again, these types of visions, they're played out by those participations. they're paid out by the communities, and then can be used as a tool to see about what choices you make in terms of what futures you particularly want for your landscape, and of course the associated costs with those futures. So the last slide is really just highlighting some of the broader work going on across the university. This is just a sort of tip of the iceberg of some of the work going on across the African Research Network, headed up by Stephanie Wynne-Jones in archaeology, Jez McCann in history, and myself in environment and geography, focusing around these environmental sustainability themes, policy and governance. And as you can see, it involves about 120 or so academics across the university, across all faculties. And as you can see from this map, in terms of where the projects are based, it has a really great depth and breadth in terms of its sort of geographical coverage. So again, just to acknowledge a whole series of sort of postdoctoral researchers, PhD students that have contributed to this work, and funders. And I'd like to leave it there. Thank you.